Dearest listeners, how often does Providence disguise itself as misfortune, leading us through embarrassment's thorny path only to deposit us in paradise's very garden? Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most delightfully scandalous tale of a charity auction gone spectacularly awry, where one young lady's mortifying mistake became society's most celebrated love match. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grosvenor Square as Miss Victoria Pemberton adjusted her spencer for the third time, her nervous fingers betraying an agitation most unusual for a young lady who had already weathered 4 London seasons. At 24, she possessed that particular combination of intelligence and independence that made matchmaking mamas whisper behind their fans and eligible gentlemen maintain a respectful, if somewhat wary, distance. Victoria stood before the looking-glass in her bedchamber, studying her reflection with the critical eye of one who had long ago accepted her place in society's hierarchy. She was neither a diamond of the first water nor a wallflower destined for spinsterhood. Her features were pleasant enough. Soft brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence, chestnut hair that refused to hold the elaborate curls so fashionable that year, and a figure that, while respectable, would never inspire poets to pen odes to her beauty. What Victoria possessed in abundance, however, was a mind that devoured books with the same enthusiasm that other young ladies reserved for bonnets and ribbons. Her father, Sir Robert Pemberton, a respected barrister who had earned his knighthood through service to the crown rather than inheritance, had made the unusual decision to educate his only daughter as thoroughly as any son. This education, while enriching her mind, had proven something of a social liability. Gentlemen, it seemed, preferred their wives to be accomplished in watercolors and pianoforte, not Latin conjugations and philosophical discourse. The Pemberton townhouse on Brook Street, while respectable, lacked the grandeur of the great aristocratic mansions that dominated Mayfair. It was a home that spoke of comfort and good taste rather than ancient wealth and privilege. The library, Victoria's sanctuary, contained more books than the drawing room held guests during their modest Tuesday afternoon salons. The room carried the comforting scent of old leather, aged paper, and beeswax polish, fragrances that had become as familiar to Victoria as her mother's lavender water. It was a house that perfectly reflected its inhabitants, dignified, intelligent, and slightly out of step with the glittering world that surrounded them. On this particular morning in late April, as the season approached its zenith, Victoria's thoughts were occupied by the afternoon's charity auction at Lady Wilmington's mansion. The event, organized to benefit the Foundling Hospital, had become one of the season's most anticipated occasions, not least because of its novel approach to fundraising. Young ladies would bid on various experiences donated by society's bachelors: a ride through Hyde Park, attendance at the opera, or, most coveted of all, an elegant dinner at Grillion's Hotel. Victoria's interest in the auction centered on one particular gentleman, Mr. Edmund Hartley, a quiet scholar who had recently returned from an archaeological expedition to Greece. She had encountered him twice at Hatchard's, where they had engaged in the most stimulating conversations about ancient history and classical literature. Mr. Hartley possessed none of the dangerous charm that made other young ladies swoon. He was tall and rather thin, with spectacles that constantly slipped down his nose and a tendency to stammer when discussing anything other than antiquities. To Victoria, he represented something far more valuable than a handsome face or a grand title. He offered the possibility of a marriage built on intellectual companionship rather than mere social advancement. Her lady's maid, Susan, entered with the Morning Post, including a note from her dearest friend, Miss Penelope Ashworth, confirming she would accompany Victoria to the auction. Penelope, blessed with golden curls and a substantial dowry, had already refused 3 proposals that season, holding out for what she termed a grand passion. She found Victoria's interest in the bookish Mr. Hartley incomprehensible, but had agreed to support her friend's scheme nonetheless. As Victoria descended to the breakfast room, she found her mother, Lady Pemberton, already seated with the morning papers. A woman of remarkable practicality who had married for love rather than position, she regarded her daughter with knowing eyes. Lady Pemberton had observed her daughter's growing interest in Mr. Hartley with mixed feelings. While she appreciated the young man's intellectual gifts and gentle nature, she worried that Victoria was settling for safety rather than seeking genuine affection. Years of watching her daughter retreat into books after each social disappointment had left Lady Pemberton wishing for something more, a gentleman who could match Victoria's intelligence while also awakening her carefully guarded heart. The conversation over breakfast touched upon the afternoon's event, with Lady Pemberton noting that the Duchess of Marlborough herself would be attending, lending the occasion and cachet that would ensure all of society's presence. Victoria merely nodded, her thoughts focused on the £50 she had saved from her allowance over the past 6 months, surely enough to secure an evening with the modest Mr. Hartley, who inspired neither fierce competition nor passionate interest among the other young ladies. What Victoria did not know, could not have known, was that Lord Nathaniel Blackstone, the very man whose name caused debutantes to whisper and matrons to scheme, had been persuaded to participate in the auction. Lord Nathaniel Blackstone, at 30 years of age, possessed a reputation that preceded him into every drawing room in London. The second son of the late Duke of Ravensdale, he had inherited his mother's striking dark features and his father's formidable intelligence, combining them with a bearing so commanding that rooms fell silent upon his entrance. His reputation as an intimidating figure stemmed not from any scandalous behavior. Indeed, his conduct was above reproach, but from his notorious inability to suffer fools and his complete disinterest in the social niceties that governed polite society. He had been known to reduce presumptuous young ladies to tears with a single raised eyebrow and to demolish pretentious gentlemen's arguments with surgical precision. His wealth was substantial, his connections impeccable, and his bachelor status the source of endless speculation. Lord Blackstone maintained a magnificent residence on Park Lane, its library rivaling that of the British Museum in certain specialized areas. He was a patron of the sciences, a member of the Royal Society, and possessed a mind that found most social interactions tediously predictable. His participation in the charity auction had been secured only through the persistent efforts of his sister, Lady Sophia Winters, who had appealed to his sense of duty toward charitable causes rather than any interest in romantic pursuits. As Victoria prepared for the auction that afternoon, carefully counting her saved funds and practicing the casual manner in which she would place her bid for Mr. Hartley, the wheels of fate were already turning. In his study on Park Lane, Lord Blackstone reviewed correspondence from his estate managers, blissfully unaware that his obligatory participation in his sister's charitable scheme would alter the carefully ordered trajectory of his life. Lady Wilmington's mansion on Piccadilly had been transformed into a glittering showcase of charitable enthusiasm. The ballroom, with its soaring ceiling painted with mythological scenes and crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon sunlight, buzzed with anticipation. Ladies in their finest afternoon gowns clustered in groups, fans fluttering as they discussed strategy and compared purses. Gentlemen, both participants and spectators, attempted to appear nonchalant while keenly observing which ladies showed interest in which offerings. Victoria entered with Penelope, her friend immediately drawing admiring glances in her jonquil silk gown adorned with seed pearls. Victoria herself had chosen her ensemble carefully. The pale blue muslin was respectable without being ostentatious, suggesting a serious mind rather than frivolous intentions. She carried her reticule containing the £50 with the gravity of a general carrying battle plans. The auction lots had been displayed on elegant cards arranged on a table near the rostrum. Victoria made her way through the crowd, searching for Mr. Hartley's offering. She found it quickly enough, an evening of dinner and edifying conversation at Grillion's Hotel, the description so perfectly matching his character that she smiled. The card was positioned between 2 others, and in her nervousness, Victoria failed to notice that the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast shadows that obscured the lot numbers. Lady Wilmington, resplendent in purple silk that proclaimed her position as one of society's premier hostesses, called the assembly to order. She stood at the rostrum with the commanding presence of one accustomed to managing the most difficult of social situations. The Duchess of Marlborough sat in the front row, her presence lending an air of supreme respectability to what might otherwise have been considered a rather daring enterprise. The early lots proceeded as expected. Miss Harriet Fosbrook secured a curricle ride through Richmond Park with the dashing Captain Morrison for £12. Lady Beatrice Huntington bid £20 for an afternoon at the Royal Academy with Mr. James Worthington, known for his artistic sensibilities. Each successful bid was met with polite applause and knowing smiles. Victoria watched Mr. Hartley standing near the French doors that opened onto the terrace. He appeared even more uncomfortable than usual, his spectacles reflecting the light as he repeatedly adjusted his cravat. He caught her eye once and offered a shy smile that strengthened her resolve. Here was a man who would appreciate her for her mind, who would engage in discussions of Plato and Aristotle rather than expecting her to simper over fashion plates. What Victoria could not see from her position was Lord Blackstone, who had arrived late and stood in the shadows near the entrance. His presence had created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like the pressure change before a storm. He wore black, as was his custom, the severe color emphasizing his dark hair and the sharp angles of his face. His expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else, possibly undergoing dental surgery or reading parliamentary reports on agricultural reform. Lady Sophia Winters, Lord Blackstone's sister, stood beside him, her hand firmly on his arm as if preventing escape. She was explaining, in whispered tones, that his participation was essential for the success of the charity, that the Foundling Hospital desperately needed the funds, and that one dinner would not, despite his dire predictions, result in social catastrophe. When Lady Wilmington announced the next lot, an evening of dinner and edifying conversation at Grillion's Hotel, Victoria's heart began to race. She waited, as was proper, for other ladies to begin the bidding. Miss Clarissa Jennings offered £5. Mrs. Dalrymple, a young widow known for her intellectual pretensions, raised it to £8. Victoria lifted her hand and declared £15, her voice carrying clearly across the room. A murmur ran through the assembly. It was a substantial bid for a gentleman of Mr. Hartley's modest standing. Several heads turned to observe the usually reserved Miss Pemberton showing such decisive interest. Mrs. Dalrymple countered with £20, her eyes narrowing with determination. Victoria hesitated only a moment. She had saved £50. Surely Mr. Hartley was worth the investment. She raised her bid to £30. The room grew quieter. Such enthusiasm for the scholarly Mr. Hartley was unexpected. Penelope squeezed Victoria's hand in support, though her expression suggested bewilderment at spending such a sum on any gentleman, let alone one who quoted ancient Greek at social gatherings. Mrs. Dalrymple appeared to consider, then shook her head with a slight smile, graciously conceding the field to Miss Pemberton. Lady Wilmington raised her gavel, calling once, twice, and declaring the lot sold to Miss Pemberton for £30. The applause was enthusiastic, though accompanied by whispered speculation. Victoria felt her cheeks warm as she made her way to the secretary's table to record her bid and arrange payment. It was only when the secretary, Mr. Blackwood, began writing the details that the catastrophic nature of her error became apparent. He announced cheerfully that lot number 17, dinner with Lord Blackstone, had been secured by Miss Pemberton for £30, a very generous contribution indeed. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. She had bid on the wrong lot. The shadows on the cards, her nervousness, her fixed attention on Mr. Hartley, all had conspired to create this mortifying mistake. Victoria stammered, attempting to articulate that there must be some error. But Mr. Blackwood looked up, confused, asking if there was a problem. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Victoria was acutely aware of every eye upon her, of the whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd like waves. She could see Mr. Hartley's bewildered expression, Mrs. Dalrymple's dawning amusement, and, worst of all, the dark figure of Lord Blackstone himself moving through the crowd toward the secretary's table. He arrived with the inevitability of Judgment Day, his presence causing the crowd to part like the Red Sea. Up close, Victoria could see that his eyes were not black as she had assumed, but a deep brown with flecks of gold, currently fixed upon her with an expression she could not read. He acknowledged that Miss Pemberton had purchased his evening, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to resonate in her very bones. Victoria lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. To admit her error now would be to humiliate not only herself, but also him, suggesting that dining with him was so repugnant that she would publicly renege on a charitable commitment. The gossip would be devastating for them both. She confirmed the purchase, stating it was for the benefit of the Foundling Hospital, her voice steadier than her racing heart. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or was it respect? He noted it was a most generous contribution and mentioned he would send word regarding the arrangements. He bowed, the gesture perfectly correct, yet somehow containing a hint of mockery, and withdrew. Victoria remained at the secretary's table, mechanically completing the financial arrangements while the room erupted in excited conversation around her. The next 3 days passed in an agony of anticipation. Victoria found herself unable to concentrate on her beloved books, starting at every knock upon the door, certain it would bring either Lord Blackstone's polite cancellation or worse, his formal arrangements for their evening. The morning post became an ordeal of nerves. Her mother, having heard the full story from Lady Wilmington herself, maintained a diplomatic silence on the subject, though Victoria occasionally caught her hiding a smile behind her teacup. Sir Robert, when informed of the situation, had merely raised an eyebrow and commented that Lord Blackstone was known to be a man of surprising depths, though what those depths contained, he declined to specify. Society, meanwhile, was ablaze with speculation. At every gathering, Victoria felt eyes upon her, heard whispers following in her wake. The story had already undergone several transformations. Some claimed she had bid £100 in a fit of passion, others that Lord Blackstone had manipulated the auction to ensure she won, still others that it was all part of an elaborate scheme orchestrated by their families. On the 4th day, a letter arrived bearing the Blackstone seal. The paper was of the finest quality, the black wax seal impressed with precision. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read the bold, decisive handwriting within. Lord Blackstone wrote with unexpected wit, acknowledging her generous contribution to charity and proposing Friday evening for their dinner at Grillion's Hotel. He noted, with what seemed like barely concealed amusement, that he found the prospect of providing edifying conversation rather daunting and requested guidance on her particular interests, whether they tended toward agricultural practices of rural Yorkshire or the mating habits of South American beetles. The letter's tone was so unexpected, formal yet tinged with an irony that suggested he was perfectly aware of her mistake and found the situation as absurd as she did. He offered her an escape, mentioning that should she develop a sudden indisposition or discover urgent need to visit elderly relatives in Scotland, he would understand completely and donate an additional sum to compensate for her charitable loss. After much deliberation, Victoria penned her response, matching his tone with her own blend of formality and subtle humor. She confirmed she had developed neither sudden indispositions nor Scottish relatives requiring visitation. As for edifying conversation, she confessed her interests were disappointingly conventional, merely history, philosophy, literature, and the occasional discourse on astronomy, having regrettably neglected the study of South American beetles, though she supposed there was always time to rectify such educational deficiencies. His reply came the next morning, brief but amusing. He expressed relief that her interests did not include beetles, as his knowledge extended only to their names and a vague understanding that they possessed 6 legs. He confirmed he would call for her at 7 o'clock on Friday evening. The intervening days brought a parade of visitors to the Pemberton household. Every female acquaintance Victoria possessed suddenly found urgent reasons to call, each hoping to glean details about the upcoming dinner. Penelope arrived daily, alternating between excitement and horror at the prospect. She regaled Victoria with increasingly dramatic tales of Lord Blackstone's social demolitions, the time he had reduced Lord Pembridge to stuttering incoherence during a debate on corn laws, the occasion when he had stared down the French ambassador until the man forgot his carefully prepared speech. Victoria's nerves, already strained, were not improved by these accounts. She found herself practicing conversations in her mind, imagining various scenarios and her responses. Would he interrogate her on her knowledge? Would he sit in stony silence while she babbled nervously? Would he use the evening to demonstrate why young ladies should not bid on gentlemen they did not know? Her mother, observing her daughter's increasing agitation, finally intervened. Lady Pemberton pointed out that Lord Blackstone, whatever his reputation, was a gentleman. He would not deliberately humiliate her. Moreover, she noted with characteristic practicality, the worst had already happened. The mistake had been made, the money spent, and the story already circulating through society. The dinner itself could hardly be worse than the anticipation. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Victoria, Lord Blackstone was experiencing his own form of discomfort. His sister, Lady Sophia, had taken to visiting daily, offering increasingly absurd advice on how to make conversation with a young lady. His valet, Peters, who had served him for 15 years, had taken the unprecedented step of suggesting his lordship might consider wearing something other than black for the occasion. A suggestion that was met with such a look that Peters retreated to the servants' hall and was not seen for the remainder of the day. Lord Blackstone found himself curious about Miss Pemberton. Her letter had revealed a wit he had not expected, and her decision to honor the bid despite the obvious mistake showed a strength of character rare in the young ladies of his acquaintance. He had made inquiries, discreet ones, and learned of her intellectual pursuits, her father's position, and her reputation as something of a bluestocking. The information intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth that had all of London seeking shade and cool drinks. Victoria had changed her gown 3 times before settling on an evening dress of deep amber silk that her mother insisted brought out the warmth in her eyes. It was more sophisticated than her usual choices, but she reasoned that dining with Lord Blackstone required all the confidence she could muster. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones announced his arrival. Victoria watched from the drawing-room window as Lord Blackstone alighted from his carriage. He wore black, naturally, but the evening clothes were of such exquisite cut and quality that they transformed severity into elegance. He moved with a controlled grace that suggested both power and restraint. When he was announced and entered the drawing-room, Victoria was struck again by his presence. He seemed to fill the space not through size alone, but through some indefinable quality that drew the eye and held it. He greeted her parents with perfect propriety, enduring her father's legal anecdotes and her mother's searching looks with equanimity. As he handed Victoria into the carriage, she noticed his hands, long-fingered and elegant, yet marked with small scars that suggested they were not merely ornamental. The carriage interior was luxurious without being ostentatious, the seats upholstered in Spanish leather, the appointments gleaming with careful maintenance. The journey to Grillion's hotel passed in surprisingly comfortable conversation. Lord Blackstone inquired about her interest in astronomy, revealing his own knowledge of recent discoveries by William Herschel. Victoria found herself relaxing as they discussed the possibility of life on other planets, the nature of nebulae, and the philosophical implications of an infinite universe. Grillion's hotel, that bastion of masculine privilege that rarely admitted ladies except for special occasions, had prepared one of its private dining rooms for the evening. The room was intimate without being inappropriate, with tall windows overlooking St. James's Street, candlelight reflecting off crystal and silver, and a fire crackling despite the warmth of the evening. The muffled sound of carriage traffic from the street below provided a gentle backdrop, while the velvet texture of the wine in her glass gave Victoria something to focus on during moments of nervous silence. As they were seated, Victoria noticed Lord Blackstone's slight discomfort with the elaborate table settings. It was a small thing, a momentary hesitation over the array of forks, but it humanized him in a way that all the gossip had not. She realized that he, too, was navigating unfamiliar waters. The conversation over the first course revealed unexpected commonalities. They discovered a mutual disdain for the popular novels of the day, though Victoria defended some of Mrs. Radcliffe's Gothic works, while Lord Blackstone admitted to a secret appreciation for Robinson Crusoe. They debated the merits of Burke versus Payne, the implications of the recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt, and whether women's education should differ from men's, a topic on which Lord Blackstone held surprisingly progressive views. As the evening progressed, Victoria observed the man behind the reputation. His intimidating demeanor, she realized, was largely defensive, a shield against the vapidity and pretension he so often encountered. When engaged on topics of substance, his eyes lit with enthusiasm, his gestures became animated, and occasionally a smile would transform his harsh features into something approaching handsome. He revealed over the fish course his work with various scientific societies, his frustration with Parliament's resistance to industrial safety reforms, and his private support of several charity schools. He spoke of his childhood, growing up in the shadow of an elder brother, groomed for the dukedom, finding solace in books and intellectual pursuits rather than the social whirl his position demanded. Victoria found herself sharing more than she had intended. Her frustration with the limitations placed on women, her secret ambition to translate classical texts, her fear that she would end her days as a spinster aunt, tolerated but never truly valued. Lord Blackstone listened with an intensity that was both unnerving and flattering, asking questions that showed he was not merely being polite, but genuinely interested in her thoughts. The moment of true connection came over dessert, an elaborate confection that neither of them touched. Victoria had been describing her attempt to read Newton's Principia in the original Latin, admitting her struggle with the mathematical concepts. Lord Blackstone leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest, and began explaining the principles in a way that suddenly made them clear. His passion for the subject transformed him, and Victoria found herself leaning in as well, their heads nearly touching over the table as he sketched diagrams on the tablecloth with his finger. It was then that their eyes met, truly met, for the first time. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with something neither had expected. Victoria felt her breath catch as she realized that Lord Blackstone's eyes held not judgment or condescension, but admiration and something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her cheeks warm. He seemed to realize it too, pulling back slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on hers. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious, before the spell was broken by a waiter entering to clear the table. The days following the dinner passed in a haze of confusion for Victoria. Lord Blackstone had been everything she had not expected: intelligent, thoughtful, occasionally amusing, and surprisingly kind. The evening had ended with his promise to send her some books from his library that might interest her, and his suggestion that they might continue their discussion of Newton at some future time. Society, naturally, was ravenous for details. Victoria found herself besieged at every social gathering, pressed for information about the mysterious Lord Blackstone. She deflected as best she could, but her reticence only fueled more speculation. Some claimed she had been seen leaving Grillions in tears, others that Lord Blackstone had been observed smiling, an event considered as rare as a solar eclipse. 3 days after the dinner, a package arrived containing 3 beautifully bound volumes: Newton's Principia with extensive annotations, a rare edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and a treatise on astronomy by Caroline Herschel. The accompanying note was brief but warm, hoping she would find the books useful and mentioning that he would be attending Lady Jersey's ball that evening. Victoria attended the ball with heightened anticipation, wearing her best gown, a creation in midnight blue that Penelope insisted made her look mysterious. She spotted Lord Blackstone immediately upon entering, his dark figure unmistakable among the colorful crowd. Their eyes met across the room, and he began moving toward her. It was then that disaster struck. Lord Fenwick, a notorious gossip and social climber, intercepted Lord Blackstone with a knowing smirk. Victoria could not hear the conversation, but she saw Lord Blackstone's expression change from warm anticipation to cold fury. He looked at her once more, his face now a mask of icy disdain, before turning on his heel and leaving the ball entirely. Victoria stood frozen, bewildered and hurt. What had Lord Fenwick said? What had changed so dramatically in the space of a moment? She endured the rest of the evening in misery, deflecting concerned inquiries and fighting back tears. The truth, as it transpired, was both simple and devastating. Lord Fenwick, seeking to ingratiate himself with Lord Blackstone, had congratulated him on his clever manipulation of the auction. He claimed to have heard from a reliable source, Mrs. Dalrymple, the widow who had bid against Victoria, that Miss Pemberton had confided her intention to bid on Lord Blackstone all along, that her supposed interest in Mr. Hartley was merely a ruse to avoid appearing too forward, and that she had boasted of her success in capturing the most elusive bachelor in London. The story was, of course, entirely false. Mrs. Dalrymple had said no such thing, and Victoria had confided in no one except Penelope, who would never betray her. But Lord Fenwick's talent lay in making lies sound like truth, in presenting gossip with such conviction that even the most skeptical listener might doubt their own judgment. Lord Blackstone, already sensitive about his participation in the auction, interpreted this false information as confirmation of his worst fears, that he had been pursued and trapped like a prize stag, that Victoria's intellectual interests and charming conversation had all been calculated to ensnare him. His pride, always his most vulnerable point, was wounded beyond bearing. Victoria, meanwhile, heard a distorted version of the same lie from Penelope 2 days later. Her friend had overheard Lady Sophia Winters discussing her brother's fury at a tea party. According to what Lady Sophia had gleaned from her brother's terse comments, someone had informed him that Miss Pemberton had deliberately set out to win him at the auction, seeing him as a challenge to be conquered. The supposed scheming and manipulation had offended his sense of honor deeply. Penelope reported that Lady Sophia seemed confused by the whole matter, as she had observed her brother's genuine pleasure after the dinner. But Lord Blackstone refused to discuss it further, retreating into his customary antisocial behavior with renewed vigor. Victoria felt the sting of injustice acutely. She had made an honest mistake, had honored her commitment despite her embarrassment, and had found unexpected pleasure in Lord Blackstone's company. To be accused of manipulation and scheming, even indirectly, wounded her deeply. Her own pride, stirred to defense, made her resolve to show Lord Blackstone that she was perfectly capable of indifference to his opinion. When they next encountered each other at a musical, Lord Blackstone offered only the stiffest of bows. Victoria, hurt by his coldness and believing he thought her a shameless schemer, responded with equal frigidity. The pattern was set. Two people who had found unexpected connection now circled each other like wary combatants, their every interaction observed and dissected by society. 2 weeks passed in this miserable state. Victoria returned Lord Blackstone's books with a formally polite note. He acknowledged their receipt with equally cold courtesy. Society watched with fascination as what had promised to be the season's most interesting attachment dissolved into Arctic indifference. The echo of footsteps on marble floors at Somerset House seemed to emphasize the distance that had grown between them whenever they found themselves at the same social gatherings. It was Lady Sophia Winters who finally uncovered the truth. Frustrated by her brother's return to his antisocial ways and suspicious of the sudden change, she conducted her own investigation. Through careful questioning and comparison of stories, she discovered Lord Fenwick's deception and the poisonous lie that had destroyed the budding connection. She began by approaching Mrs. Dalrymple at a card party, casually mentioning the auction and Victoria's supposed confidence. Mrs. Dalrymple expressed complete bewilderment, stating she had never spoken to Miss Pemberton about the auction beyond a brief, gracious exchange when conceding the bidding. She had certainly never heard any boasting or scheming. Armed with this information, Lady Sophia confronted Lord Fenwick at the same gathering. Her accusations were so precise and her evidence so damning that he fled London that very night, claiming urgent business on his estates in Ireland. But the damage was done, and Lady Sophia faced the delicate task of revealing the truth to two people whose pride had been so thoroughly wounded. She began with Victoria, calling upon her on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon. The cold air of the Pemberton drawing room seemed to mirror the chill that had settled over Victoria's heart since the misunderstanding began. Lady Sophia was direct in her approach, explaining Lord Fenwick's lies and her brother's reaction. She described how Lord Blackstone had been genuinely pleased by Victoria's company, how he had spoken of her intelligence and wit with admiration, and how the false report of her supposed manipulation had wounded him deeply. Victoria listened in growing horror and understanding. The pieces fell into place. Lord Blackstone's sudden coldness, his departure from the ball, the formal distance he now maintained. Lady Sophia explained that her brother believed Victoria had deliberately schemed to win him at the auction, using Mr. Hartley as a cover for her true intentions. The lie had been crafted to wound precisely because Lord Blackstone had begun to trust, had allowed himself to hope for genuine connection. Lady Sophia then revealed something more. Lord Blackstone had been preparing to court Victoria properly. He had consulted with her father, seeking permission to call upon her. He had even begun to emerge from his self-imposed social exile, accepting invitations he would previously have declined, all in the hope of furthering their acquaintance. The revelation brought tears to Victoria's eyes. She had allowed pride and hurt feelings to prevent her from seeking the truth, had assumed the worst rather than trusting the connection they had shared. But how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them? Lord Blackstone's pride was legendary, and he believed himself deceived and manipulated. Lady Sophia had a solution, though it required considerable courage. A charity exhibition was being held at Somerset House, displaying artwork to benefit the same foundling hospital that had brought them together. Lord Blackstone would attend, as he was one of the patrons. If Victoria could find a way to communicate the truth, to break through his pride and hurt, perhaps the damage could be repaired. Victoria spent the next 3 days in preparation. She could not simply approach him and explain. His pride would make him defensive, skeptical. Instead, she needed to show him, to demonstrate through action rather than words, that their connection had been genuine. She discovered, through careful inquiry, that Lord Blackstone had commissioned a painting for the exhibition, a landscape of his estate in Derbyshire. She also learned that he particularly admired the work of J.M.W. Turner, finding in the artist's dramatic use of light and shadow a reflection of nature's sublime power. On the day of the exhibition, Victoria arrived early, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. She wore the amber gown from their dinner, a deliberate choice she hoped he would recognize. She positioned herself near his commissioned painting, studying it with genuine interest. The landscape was beautiful. Rolling hills and ancient oaks rendered with loving detail, a house in the distance that suggested warmth and welcome rather than cold grandeur. When Lord Blackstone arrived, she felt rather than saw his presence. The soft echo of his footsteps on the marble floor sent a shiver through her. He moved through the gallery with his usual commanding air, acknowledging acquaintances with the barest civility. When he saw her standing before his painting, he stopped, his expression unreadable. Victoria did not turn, but spoke quietly, knowing he could hear her. She began discussing the painting, noting the way the artist had captured the quality of light that suggested early morning, the promise of a new day. She spoke of how the landscape revealed the owner's true nature, not the harsh, forbidding character society perceived, but someone who valued beauty, permanence, and home. She then moved to the next painting, continuing her commentary. She wove into her observations references to their dinner conversation, a mention of Newton when discussing the use of perspective, a quote from Wollstonecraft when admiring a portrait of a female scholar. Each reference was subtle but deliberate, a reminder of the genuine connection they had shared. Lord Blackstone followed at a distance, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Others in the gallery began to notice, creating a small audience for this unusual performance. Victoria continued, moving from painting to painting, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. Finally, she stopped before Turner's latest work, a tempestuous seascape that dominated an entire wall. She stood silent for a long moment, then spoke of the painting's depiction of storm and calm, of how the turbulent waters would eventually find peace, but only after the storm had passed and truth had emerged from beneath the obscuring clouds. She turned then, meeting Lord Blackstone's eyes directly for the first time. In her gaze was vulnerability, honesty, and something more, a clear acknowledgement of what had grown between them during that single evening. She held his gaze for a long moment, then curtsied and moved to leave the gallery. Lord Blackstone stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then, too, the entire gallery seemed to hold its breath. Then, with decisive strides that echoed through the space, he followed her. He caught up with her just as she reached the entrance, his hand gently but firmly catching her elbow. The conversation that followed, conducted in the semi-privacy of Somerset House's entrance hall while rain poured outside, was perhaps the most important of both their lives. Lord Blackstone, his pride finally conquered by the greater force of genuine feeling, listened as Victoria explained the truth of the auction, her original intention to bid on Mr. Hartley, and the complete fabrication of Lord Fenwick's tales. She spoke with a directness that he had come to value, admitting her own fault in not seeking clarification when his behavior changed so suddenly. She confessed that the evening at Grillion's had been the most intellectually and emotionally stimulating of her life, that she had found in him not the intimidating figure of reputation, but a kindred spirit whose company she valued above all others. Lord Blackstone, in turn, revealed his own struggles. He admitted that his fearsome reputation was partly cultivated, a defense against the marriage-minded mamas and vapid debutantes who saw only his wealth and connections. He confessed that Victoria's apparent interest had pleased him more than he cared to admit, and that Lord Fenwick's lies had wounded him precisely because he had begun to hope for something he had thought beyond his reach, a true partnership of minds and hearts. He apologized for his readiness to believe the worst, for allowing pride to overshadow judgment. He admitted that the past weeks had been miserable, that he had found himself rereading her letters, remembering their conversation, and wishing he had possessed the courage to demand an explanation rather than retreating into cold silence. As they spoke, the rain began to lessen, and shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the entrance hall with golden light. It seemed providential, a blessing upon their renewed understanding. Lord Blackstone then did something that shocked the several observers who had gathered at a discreet distance. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his entire countenance, and offered Victoria his arm. She accepted, and they walked back into the gallery together, this time as a united couple rather than separated individuals. The courtship that followed was both proper and unusual. Lord Blackstone called upon Victoria regularly, but instead of the typical morning calls filled with empty pleasantries, they engaged in spirited debates, shared books, and conducted experiments with the telescope Lord Blackstone had delivered to the Pemberton house. They attended lectures at the Royal Society together, scandalizing some and delighting others with their obvious intellectual compatibility. Society watched in fascination as Lord Blackstone, the man who had terrorized the ton for years, was observed helping Victoria with her cloak, fetching her lemonade at balls, and, most shocking of all, dancing with her multiple times at each event, his expression softening whenever she spoke. Victoria, for her part, blossomed under his attention. Her confidence grew as she realized she was valued not despite her intelligence, but because of it. She found herself able to navigate society with new assurance, knowing that Lord Blackstone stood ready to demolish anyone who dared condescend to her. The proposal, when it came, was characteristic of them both. It occurred in the British Museum, where they had gone to view a new acquisition of ancient Greek texts. Lord Blackstone had arranged for private access, and as Victoria excitedly translated a passage from Sappho, he quietly placed a ring upon the manuscript, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the blue stone exactly matching the color of the gown she had worn to Lady Jersey's ball. Victoria's acceptance was given through tears of joy, followed immediately by a spirited discussion of whether the wedding breakfast should feature quotes from Latin or Greek texts on the place cards. Lord Blackstone suggested both, then kissed her hand in a gesture that somehow contained more passion than many more demonstrative displays. The wedding, held at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a brilliant morning in September, was attended by all of society. Those who had expected Lord Blackstone to look severe and Victoria to appear nervous were disappointed. The groom smiled throughout the ceremony, his eyes never leaving his bride, while Victoria radiated a joy that transformed her pleasant features into genuine beauty. Lady Sophia Winters, serving as matron of honor, was overhead remarking that she had never seen her brother so happy, and that she fully expected her new sister-in-law to keep him that way through liberal application of intellectual stimulation and affectionate exasperation. The wedding breakfast featured Lord Fenwick's notable absence. He remained in Ireland, apparently permanently, and Mrs. Dalrymple's presence. That good lady had been mortified to learn how her name had been used in the deception and had become one of Victoria's most vocal supporters, praising the match to anyone who would listen. Mr. Hartley attended with his new fiancée, Miss Cecilia Weatherby, both looking pleased with their own quiet happiness. He approached Victoria during the reception with genuine warmth, expressing his sincere congratulations. He admitted that while he had always admired Victoria's brilliant mind and respected her intellectual prowess immensely, he had come to realize that the partnership he truly desired was one of quieter harmonies. The passionate intellectual debates that energized Victoria would have exhausted him over time, whereas with Cecilia, he had found a gentle meeting of minds that brought him peace rather than stimulation. He wished Victoria every happiness, acknowledging that she and Lord Blackstone were perfectly matched in their mutual appetite for intellectual challenge and discovery. Miss Weatherby added her own congratulations, confessing she was grateful for the auction's outcome, as it had brought her together with Edmund at precisely the right moment. They shared a love of quiet scholarship and domestic tranquility that would have been impossible had he been matched with Victoria's more forceful intellect. The speech Lord Blackstone gave moved many to tears, though he would have been horrified to know it. He spoke simply but eloquently of finding light in unexpected places, of the courage required to bid on happiness, and of his profound gratitude to the Foundling Hospital for providing the occasion that brought him his wife. He then announced a donation of £1,000 to the charity, in honor of the £30 that had changed his life. Victoria's speech, for she insisted on giving one, propriety be damned, thanked everyone for attending, and made special mention of shadows and sunlight, of mistakes that proved to be providence, and of the importance of looking beyond reputation to find truth. She concluded by noting that, while she had bid on the wrong bachelor at the auction, the right one had indeed claimed her, and she could not be more pleased with the outcome. The couple departed for Lord Blackstone's estate in Derbyshire, where they would spend their honeymoon reading, riding, and engaging in the sort of conversations that had brought them together. Society predicted they would either be blissfully happy or murder each other within a fortnight. As it happened, they were blissfully happy, though their debates occasionally reached volumes that alarmed the servants until they realized their master and mistress were simply enjoying themselves. Their library became legendary, their soirees attracted the finest minds of the age, and their children, 3 boys and 2 girls, grew up believing it perfectly normal for parents to discuss Aristotle over breakfast and conduct chemistry experiments in the conservatory. Lord Blackstone never entirely lost his intimidating manner with fools and social climbers, but those who knew him well observed that he smiled more often, especially when his wife was present. Victoria became one of society's most respected hostesses, not for the grandeur of her entertainments, but for their intellectual stimulation and the warmth of her welcome to those who genuinely wished to expand their minds. Pride, we see, is a fortress that can both protect a heart and imprison it. But true understanding, it seems, is the master key that can, with a little courage, unlock any door. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. And sometimes, just sometimes, a mistake at a charity auction can lead to the greatest fortune of all. A marriage of true minds, where respect and affection, passion and intellect combine to create that rarest of treasures, a love that enriches not only 2 hearts, but all who have the privilege to witness it. The story of the charity auction became legend in the ton, told and retold with various embellishments. Young ladies began deliberately bidding on the wrong gentleman at such events, though none achieved quite the spectacular success of Miss Victoria Pemberton, who bid £30 on the wrong bachelor and won a lifetime of happiness with exactly the right man.